Well, good afternoon and welcome to the final virtual College of Liberal Arts faculty colloquium of the spring 2022 semester. I'm really glad we got a pretty good number of people here, but I'm glad everyone was able to make it after we had to postpone the presentation last week. Technical difficulties, can't kind of predict that, but thank you for joining us today. My name's Dr. Quentin Maynard. I will be moderating today's talk. Do that. And I'll be moderating today's talk. Before I turn things over to Dr. Callahan, I'd like to make a few comments. We are recording this session and streaming it live to Facebook. So if you're on Facebook, hello. If you have any questions for the speaker, please type them in the chat box or the Q&A. Actually, type it in the Q&A, and at the end of the presentation, we have a time for Dr. Callahan to respond to those questions. If we have any students in the audience who wish to receive extra credit for attending today's talk, send me a message using the chat stating your name, your professor's name, and the course that you're trying to receive extra credit for. So without further delay, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jason Callahan. Dr. Jason Callahan was hired here at USI in the fall of 2020 as an assistant professor of criminal justice. Prior to arriving at USI, he obtained his doctorate from Virginia Tech. Dr. Callahan's PhD is in sociology, where his preliminary exams were in crime and deviance, as well as culture. Before attending graduate school, he had a 10+ year career in law enforcement. The majority of his time in law enforcement was spent in the Northern Virginia, Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. Dr. Callahan's law enforcement and educational experience led him to develop strong interests in media and crime, police culture, and crime and deviance. So that's all I've got. Dr. Callahan, the screen and our virtual floor is yours.
All right. Thank you again, Quentin. I appreciate everyone's time. I know it is the last day of class, and we kind of had an unexpected power outage last week. So I do thank you for your time on a Friday, and I'll go ahead and jump right in so that way I'm not laboring this too terribly much. But as Quentin said, I am Dr. Jason Callahan. I am a assistant professor of criminal justice here. I've been working with a research assistant from Virginia Tech. She was in the same program as me there, and fortunately through CLAFTA, I've been able to acquire some funds to have her kind of help me out with this research endeavor that we've been taking on for about a year or so, and we're mostly done with this project. I'd say we're probably about 90% or so done with the manuscript, so we're hoping to be able to push something out here fairly soon. But as you can tell from the title page here, this is something that focuses on sort of the differences that we have with media representation of specifically police use of force, and this is looking at really kind of a tumultuous time that we've had in law enforcement. I wouldn't even say just since 2020, but really the way that this has kind of picked up in recent times after a lot of very high profile types of events. So just to kind of set up a little bit of the direction of where we're going with this and kind of what I'm trying to get from this research, kind of have to set up with what we think of when something is actually being made to be news, when it's being presented out to us as an actual audience that's consuming this. And there's a lot of authors, and this is really just kind of a snapshot of some of the very foundational work that we've seen from Epstein, Carabine, and Surratt that really focus on crime and crime media. That oftentimes when we have some of these stories that are making headlines, these three individuals, among others, really have a lot of shared characteristics of what is really placed as importance. So a lot of things like immediacy, something's happening right now, some type of public safety issue that's happening. Oftentimes this is involving law and order or some type of depiction of violence. And then occasionally we're also bringing in some aspects of public policy, sort of a larger picture to it. And not that every story has to follow these, and it certainly doesn't have to have all of these elements, but certainly when we do see multiples of these are typically things that are making either breaking news or headlines and things like that. And as we start to transition sort of from maybe traditional legacy styles of news, which many of those authors and researchers were focused on, and we get into a little bit more of the advent of new technology especially things like social media, and really the ability for audiences now to get information in real time as it's unfolding, that many of these values that we saw before are maybe tweaked or are nuanced a little bit more. And Yvonne Jukes really looks at this sort of as the new values for the new millennium. So we do see a lot of the same shared concepts that we saw earlier, but now we're looking at this and almost digesting a lot of these elements more as infotainment rather than just getting actual real stories that are coming through. And especially if you look at the medium in which you're getting these types of stories, a la Twitter or Facebook or something like that, usually you're only getting snapshots. You're getting very bite-sized morsels of what the story is going to be. And oftentimes consuming audiences aren't necessarily following down the URL to see what further information they're getting from this. Instead, they're more or less digesting a lot of these headlines and starting to either form opinions or trying to get maybe the important messages from these. But you can see a lot of these characteristics on the screen here that really do share previously what we had seen with a lot of our traditional or legacy media, where usually there's some sort of law and order event, some type of violence or conflict, certainly something that is immediate or is still going on, but also you see some of these where it relates sort of to these bite-sized samples where it's very simplistic, it's very individualistic, but also we're kind of feeding on things like risk and sex and persons of high status to kind of lure you in to see what some of these are going to be. And where it gets to be important, especially from the concept of how we're analyzing sort of what the broad message of my research is, which is how police use of force is reported on, it also brings in a lot of conservative or political sort of ideologies with things like crime control and get tough on crime and things like that, which I'll elaborate on here in just a few minutes. But what are these messages actually conveying to our audience? And again, to kind of bring this into what we're doing with this media once we get it, or what we're doing with this information once we've seen it or experienced it, we have sort of nuances from what had previously been sort of Gerbner and Gross's cultivation theory, which is very highly contested. And essentially what their research found back in 1974 was that consuming audiences really could have their opinions impacted by what messages they're seeing. And specifically when they were talking about sort of the consumption of violence and a lot of crime and law and order types of things, that they may get the impression that they are more vulnerable or perhaps that they could be more affected from crime than the actual reality of them actually being victimized from it. In criminal justice, sometimes we talk about this as the victimization paradox, that sometimes when consuming or when confronted with a lot of these types of elements, we might get the impression that we could be more vulnerable for certain types of crime depending on who we are or where it is that we're located. And sometimes these expectations aren't quite as realistic as maybe its portrayal. And certainly cultivation theory has had a lot of criticism for it, namely one that we are all really unable to sort of parse out the accuracy of some of these stories, or that we don't have agency to be able to say, is this really accurate? What are we able to get from this? And really Gerbner and Gross's conclusions didn't necessarily fit a lot of the testing for what they had. When other factors were involved, the effect wasn't quite as strong as what they had maybe hoped that it would be. But there is still, I think, some merit to some of the conclusions that they were able to draw, despite the fact that it's not necessarily the most methodologically advanced or I'd say accurate type of a project. But we have other researchers that have kind of added their twists and their nuance to what cultivation could be for those that are maybe specifically looking out or selecting certain types of media. And it's not so much that they are being influenced in a way that they are becoming fearful of certain types of things. But what Trump said really with this kind of nuanced way of looking at cultivation is that oftentimes we're looking through, whether it's with social media or if it's with just what you're seeing on television, but we're selecting sources to get our information most of the time. And that a lot of times this sort of first order cultivation is that we're trying to get information or just background on what the social problem is that we're interested in. And it's when you have sort of the second order cultivation that really galvanizes the opinions that you start to form, in that you're now intentionally only looking at one source of media or one source that's telling you a story that perhaps isn't the complete story. Joggle and Fru kind of expand on this a little bit more, that especially when we're looking at sort of how it is that we use either media or news to start to build down or build up our moral foundation, especially when we get into political thought, that there can be a lot of sway depending on what source it is that you're getting your information from. And this is very, very vital to this project because we're going to look at very similar events, but portrayal of these events come across very, very drastically different than they would be depending on the source that you're getting this from. And as this relates to law enforcement, we've kind of been building or transitioning into a sort of a new model of policing, away from sort of this very professional model where it's very bureaucratic, very rigid, and getting into much more of, or at least the hope is that we have much more emphasis on community policing, or that we have members of the community that feel that law enforcement isn't necessarily just a one-way street, that they have a lot more input into perhaps what their police department can do for them, but also that they can be sort of regarded with some of the fundamental decisions or types of policing on certain issues that may impact them. And some of this is kind of spurred on from sort of this broken windows perspective that Wilson and Kelly first started to talk about back in the 80s. But then also it's very difficult now to get into even just looking at local law enforcement mission statements that don't have some piece that connects to community policing in some sort. I know that the Evansville Police Department has that built into their mission statement. I would imagine that if I were to look at Vanderbilt County Sheriff's Department, they probably would have something similar where they're actually advertising to the public to say, we're here because we're trying to open up this relationship with you. And some of this, especially now after some of these very high profile types of police use of force incidents have happened, that this relationship certainly has been damaged. And in some cases, you have certain agencies that are trying to build this back up, but we don't necessarily see that the communities are really still having that lasting trust with some of their local law enforcement or with police in general. And when we start to see that this became such an imperative problem, especially recently after the events of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri back in 2014, that then President Obama convened with a lot of other major police chiefs and high-ranking officials within the law enforcement industry, so to speak, to get together to see how it is that some of these police community relationships can be repaired. And some of the major findings that they were able to identify were that there are lasting images of what perceptions of police legitimacy actually is. And it all seems to be based on how it is that law enforcement is either conducted or the roles that they perceive that they have to give to the public. And where we start to see conflicting messages is that oftentimes the communities are looking for law enforcement to be sort of guardians of the public or guardians of their community, whereas there's a lot of police culture that really embraces the fact that they are sort of warriors because they are the ones that are walking that thin blue line between anarchy and chaos, and that they are constantly trying to build up their strength, build up their resolve, because there could be threats that are coming from any which direction. And obviously these are incompatible types of roles that you don't necessarily have a lot of welcoming or a lot of trust building that goes on when you build up this persona or this culture of law enforcement to say that we are warriors. Yes, we are warriors for the public, but they are warriors nonetheless that you see just as this picture is, that sometimes it can get to be that it resembles almost militarization, much more than it is sort of this openness or building relationships with the public. So all that said, this is starting to kind of build into what is it that I'm interested in with this research. So as I mentioned, sort of the evolution that we have sort of news media to embrace technology, social media is something that has really, really taken off. And I'm interested, especially from sort of the infotainment type of presentation that Jukes has identified, that if we're looking at sort of these bite-sized morsels of information, there's no better platform than Twitter, because essentially that's what this platform is there for. You can't have long drawn out stories. You have limitations on the actual number of characters that you can present out. So knowing that many industries will use Twitter sometimes for marketing, but also if you're using this from a news media standpoint, these are the way that these organizations can go and put out news stories, again, in real time. And the assumption here is that these are probably the most vital for the public to either be aware of, especially if this is a law and order or a sort of sensitive topic where it could be that this impacts people's actual lives, that you're trying to prevent them from going into a dangerous area where perhaps something is going on that could be harmful to them. But also, if you take a step back and maybe you're digesting sort of the events of the day, these essentially are working as headlines. And for many of the public that are using Twitter to gather their news information, this may be the only way that they're able to sort of understand what's going on with the day without going into further investigation. So I picked two very specific sources for very intentional reasons, that being CNN and Fox News, because these are both cable provided news broadcasters, but also they come from very different perspectives ideologically on the political spectrum. It makes sense that they're going to report on the same types of stories, but I was very interested to see how it is that they start to characterize these events. So I'm looking very much more at some of the media frames and crime reporting, specifically as it pertains to police use of force. And in doing this, I'm able to go and actually historically go back and look at Twitter contributions revolving around some of these major themes to try to frame these events in a way that makes sense or that I can see some type of a pattern with. So I was able to do so by using the platform of Track My Hashtag that actually will go back and historically provide data from Twitter. Sometimes, depending on the time period that you're looking at, this is free. We ended up having to pay to get access to some of these historical tweets because enough time had gone by. And these tweets, as they came in, were then analyzed using the in vivo qualitative program where I'm able to actually go and develop codes and start to categorize some of these, the text of these tweets to see where they start to line up. So the periods of time that I'm looking at was, again, very intentional, selected May 25th, 2020, which is the day that George Floyd was killed. And this period goes all the way through to November 3rd, which was the presidential election. So there's a lot that's really building and riding up during this period of time. And certainly things that are very politically based. So the hope here was that I would be able to sort of glean from these two sources sort of the impetus or what was going to be relevant to them and maybe their audience based on this time period and based on some of these events. So what I ended up with once I had clean data, because these actually came through as hard data for everything. So during that period of time, CNN actually had, it was 21,000 or a little over 21,000 tweets during that entire period of time. And once it was cleaned to have relevancy to either the police or police use of force or perspectives of police reform, this all came down to 2,200, just over 2,200, or about 10% of the original data. Fox News did not tweet quite as much during this period of time. Their unclean data was looking at just over 2,500 tweets. And once that was clean, that ended up coming down to 518. But you can see the percentage of these from the clean to the original data that was actually used for this. So what did I find when I was looking through this data? Obviously, I was trying to inductively try to come up with themes and with codes, depending on what the messages were that I was getting from this information. I had some original things that I was expecting to find, but these were able to sort of organize through into 40 individual codes that were then organized in 4 major themes, as you can see here. And then you have 8 different sub-themes that emerged underneath all of these. So you can start to see sort of the direction that I was getting with the information that was here. Certainly this idea of politicizing actions goes back to a little bit of that warrior or guardian type of perspective of police roles, that on the one hand, you have sort of a very staunch law and order perspective. And on the other hand, you have much more criminal justice issues, meaning that there are issues that needed to either be rectified or had to be reformed or something like that. And then you can get into sort of the individual ones that are coming up underneath. Obviously, the police was a very large role in this because they are the largest character or actor within the study. But then you can start to see different differences with calls to action, really using names of individuals as a rallying call. And we'll kind of get into a little bit more of what that looks like when we look at some of these example tweets. But as it breaks down, you can see that activism is sort of the largest of these themes that went through. And so some of the things that go along with sort of this activism response is looking at calls for police reform, or having some type of policy changes that are based on some of these actions. But then also along with activism were characterized by things like protests, riots, arrests, and things like that. So you can see that that obviously takes up a fairly large portion of this. And if we look at the data itself, that out of the coded responses I had that were nearly 6,500, over half of those are belonging just to this activism standpoint. So, or to just that theme itself. So what does this mean, right? Without going through all 40 of these individual codes, I wanted to kind of break down to see what was the most prevalent. What did we see the most that was coming out from this? And as you can see, there are similarities and there are differences with sort of the top 5 codes that I saw from each of these sources. On CNN side, the citizen name, what's meant by this is anytime that George Floyd was referenced, individuals like Breonna Taylor, or anyone that was the victim of police violence, this would go into that actual categorization, or to that coded reference. And you can see that they are referenced quite a lot. And I think it comes out to just a little bit under 40% of all the tweets from CNN, they reference one of these individuals. And that becomes important, as we'll see again with some of the descriptions of what these tweets actually look like, because sometimes this person is mentioned, and yes, it is relevant to the case in hand, but the rest of the information that follows doesn't really necessarily line up. And I'll give some examples of what that would look like. Followed by that, then you have protests, accounts of police deadly force, police misconduct, and something that's notable that's on here also, the 5th most common that we saw from CNN is just repetition, meaning that this was the exact same tweet that was verbatim retweeted or had maybe 1 or 2 words that were changed, but was the exact copy of a tweet that had already previously gone out. So this starts to give the impression of somewhat of agenda setting, because you have this relevancy or this bombardment of the same type of tweet that's coming again and again and again onto some of these consumers' timelines. And we contrast that with some of the top codes that we saw that were coming from Fox News. A large part of this goes to protests, but the way that many of these protests were actually framed in the reporting of this tweet didn't really necessarily give the impression that these were peaceful protests. And as we'll see when we start to dissect some of these tweets, they resemble much more of what riots would be characterized as, without actually calling these events riots. It would be indicative of a lot of violence, of arrests, of attacks, or violence against law enforcement, violence against personal property or other individuals, and things like that. So you can start to see where this begins to then fall in line. And also you'll see that citizen name is something that comes up very frequently too. That's the 2nd most common type of code that I saw from Fox News. And unlike what we saw with sort of the way that these names were invoked from CNN, many of these are sort of using co-opting messages, meaning that, again, that these are not necessarily protests, but these are sometimes messages that are being usurped, so that there are riots that are going on in the name of these other individuals that have experienced some type of police violence. So this starts to frame a lot of these different types of issues. We have very much this division or this antagonistic relationship between, are these events that go on, are these categorized more as riots, or are these protests? Is this civil arrest, or is this the use of violence to loot and to riot? And depending on which source you're getting your information from, it was portrayed very drastically different. We also start to see sort of the use of police as a political tool. Certainly we have, the reputation of CNN being far more liberal and Fox News being far more conservative. You would actually start to see some of these messages seeping into the way that these tweets were actually going out, that it was either very pro-police or defending police, or it was something that was much different, where it was calls for immediate police reform, not so much defunding the police, but certainly taking money away from resources that police had and moving them into some other types of programs. So not to say that we're doing away with police altogether, but we're maybe limiting the actual emphasis that they have with their role. And obviously this is meant to symbolize sort of this polarization of events based on sort of political ideology. But you're also using individuals, whether they are victims of police violence, or we're now starting to see groups that are characterized. I used this in the case of any time that Black Lives Matter were mentioned, Back the Blue, I Can't Breathe, Say Her Name. A lot of these rallying calls that were behind very specific organizations or groups, and really the use of these to be very much politicized as well. And then what I started to find, which was unexpected to me, was really a lot of the grounded roots that we saw with many of these messages that really echoed a lot of the perceived roles that we had of law enforcement, between either being this warrior that is standing up for law and order, or if it was the guardian that the law enforcement now needed to transition into being much more public serving, or their actions were scrutinized for police legitimacy and things like that. So let's get into a little bit of what some of these tweets actually look like. It's one thing to go and categorize them into these very large groups, but I think it's much more impactful to see, well, what is the substance of these? And you can see, going back to that first major point, the way that these same events are portrayed very differently, between either being something that is a source of protest that is hoping to get some type of change in the system, or if these are things that are now resembling more of riots or lawlessness. And as you can see here from many of the texts, they paint completely different types of pictures. The first that's on there, that's talking about Breonna Taylor's case, that has inspired protests in the hopes of trying to have things like banning no-knock warrants and hiring new police chiefs, where we thought that that was something that was maybe not working out for the members of that community. And we have similar types that go with these too, that these are protests that are inspired to hopefully make some type of change. But if you look at the other reporting on the other side, it paints a much different picture, that these are not actually peaceful protests. We have Fox News that's looking at Antifa coming through and starting riots and causing arrests, and how this is going to break out, not just from sort of these metropolitan areas, but into suburbia. You can also see that just with one of these riots that had occurred, and I will say it as a riot because it's the way it's being portrayed, that there were multiple arrests that were made during one night. You have multiple either casualties or injuries to police officers that again are in the name of, here it's unnamed as the shooting of a Black man, rather than actually saying who that person was. But you can start to see a much different picture that's being portrayed based on what these events actually are. And in a very similar fashion, we see that some of these messages are sort of being either reinforced because we have protests that are meant to be rallying behind individuals that have experienced police violence, like Breonna Taylor, like George Floyd, like Jacob Blake, and among others during this period of time. But it's calling for, in the names of these individuals, to inspire some type of change because of racial injustice, calling for police reform and things like that, which again gives very much this idea that that these are peaceful protests, that these are being meant to deliver messages of change. Whereas we have other parts of this that these messages are in some cases being co-opted, that we have individuals that are actually going in under the guise of peaceful protest to actually go and commit crime, that they're actually going to commit some sort of violence, looting, rioting, fronts on law enforcement and things like that. And you can see with the last tweet that was on there from Fox News that these Breonna Taylor protests really inspired Portland police to be targeted from Molotov cocktails, being pegged with soup cans during riots. So it gives a very different type of situation that, again, depending on where you're getting this information from, it's showing two very, very different pictures. Getting into sort of the guardian and warrior type of response of what I saw with this, though, is that we have, again, sort of these connections that we have on one hand on CNN, that you have these protests that are designed to have facilitating of some sort of change that we're trying to maybe alleviate some responsibility from law enforcement and place it into community-based responders for certain types of calls. Of, again, not necessarily just saying we need to defund the police and get away with them altogether, but maybe we need to reallocate some resources to alleviate the responsibilities where maybe police aren't necessarily needed or are not the answer. We also see where this can also be reflected with reallocating money for other types of services like we have here. But you have sort of a pushback on another side that says, well, really, it seems like the police are being targeted now, that we have, based on sort of these riots and protests that are going on, that police now are being vilified, that they're being demonized, as this first tweet says here on Fox News. That this is now seeping into morale of the institution, where you have almost a 50% spike in officers filing for retirement based on sort of what had happened during some of these events. So it shows much more of this lawlessness and how the individuals that were supposed to be expected to maintain order are the ones that are actually being attacked. And in some cases, this justifies a little bit of maybe some of the mentality that goes into this. So really, what I'm getting from this is, again, not trying to portray that you believe in one side or the other, or that I'm advocating for one or the other, as much as it is that many of these stories from these sources really are serving more as echo chambers for the audience. That really is there to galvanize pre-existing notions or beliefs that they already have. And it's not really there to try to generate new audiences coming in, but rather to sort of maintain the ones that are already there. And I think that probably a good way to look at this also is that you probably have an audience that's in mind, that many of these stories are going to resonate with in some type of a way, or they're going to, they'll connect with, or it's going to reaffirm beliefs that they thought were already there. And most of the time, you probably are not having audiences that are going to cross-pollinate, meaning that for the most part, many of the audiences that are there to get their information from CNN or Fox News are probably not sampling it from the other side either. But in doing so, it's creating sort of this division, very much an us versus them type of mentality, where it is very much this dividing type of line that is creating very divisive narratives. But if we're looking at it and looking at the sort of the way that Twitter is intentionally created, there's not a lot of room for full details to come through. And if the only information that you're actually getting from these tweets that are showing up on your timeline are these very limited characters that you can get, you probably aren't getting the entire story. But you also probably aren't getting the taste of really flushing through what the entire bias might be coming through from whatever particular source it is that you have. So that really is the nuts and bolts of what my project is. As I mentioned, I do have a research assistant that has been helping me out with a lot of the sort of the organization, obtaining data, and kind of filing through some of this. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that Wendy has been really instrumental with getting this research moving and hopefully published in the very near future. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen for the moment, and I guess open it up to Q&A.
All right, so if anyone has any questions, go ahead and just post it in the Q&A box, and I will go ahead and read it. And we got one. All right, so from Andrew Buck, why aren't these news organizations tweeting? I'm sorry. Why aren't these news organizations tweeting, is it both peaceful protests and riots?
So I'm trying to think of how to answer. It can be both, I guess, right? Because we do have the fact that in some cases violence has erupted. We certainly have violence that's been perpetrated against either law enforcement themselves or businesses, other people that are there. So it's not to say that you can't necessarily go and report on both, or you can't tweet about both, because they are happening. It's just that depending on the source that you had that was there, we saw it really leading to either an either or type of situation. We didn't necessarily see, the peaceful protests would be something that was really I don't want to say advertised, but produced by Fox News as a contributor. Much more of their tweets were far more focused on things like violence and looting and attacks on law enforcement and things like that.
All right. The next question from Harrison. Were you pleased with your results, and were you surprised by what you found?
I don't think I was particularly surprised by part of this. I think knowing sort of the reputations that these providers have, I think it's been well documented from a lot of individuals that there is bias that goes with these reporting. And again, sort of the way that we have news as it's set up, especially from a cable news provider, is that they are there. This is sort of a model or a market model of an institution. This is not solely just giving out information to the public, although sometimes it is construed that way, that there are personal biases that start to seep into this. So I was not entirely surprised to see some of the political ideology that I did see. I was surprised to see how much of the kind of concepts that I had towards these police roles of the guardian and warrior are actually found in that. And it very much aligns with sort of this political ideology that I kind of expected to see. So I don't know that, I mean, you didn't necessarily have CNN saying, well, law enforcement needs to be the guardian of the public. This is what they need to do, in the same way that we saw findings from that police conference that we had back in 2015. And vice versa, we didn't necessarily see that, I mean, although we did see, I guess in some cases, Fox News would say that, well, police are under attack. They're the ones that are supposed to be there kind of protecting. And if they're the ones that are facing all of these threats, perhaps it validates them kind of taking on a little bit of this persona of being a warrior, that they're, have danger that kind of faces them at any type of quarter. So as I mentioned, some of these were a little surprising just with that, but as far as kind of seeing the way that some of these stories were represented, I don't think it was quite as much.
Same events are portrayed.
Oh. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
All right, the next question from an anonymous attendee. Will news outlets continue, or let me hit that answer button. Will news outlets continue to put divisive and incomplete headlines out there? If so, how can that be fixed?
I think because a lot of this is very much audience driven, and that, a lot of, at least these two sources are looking not necessarily to say that, they're giving the full portrayal of all the facts, even though sometimes it may be in their byline that there is bias that's included with that. I think that there is some intention to, at least the way that some of these tweets will come out, whether it's from, again, like a market model of trying to just maintain the audience that you already have. I don't know that this is something that really, with the direction that a lot of news media is currently taking, that they're looking at consumers as your product, right? This is how they're able to sustain sort of this live coverage 24-hour news cycle type of thing, is because they know that the person that's consuming these things and that is now kind of getting behind it, this is the product. It's not necessarily the news quite as much as what it had been previously under a lot of your legacy style type of news.
All right, next. One wonderful presentation and very interesting research. I was wondering if you plan to compare more neutral sources, NPR, for instance.
I think that would be very interesting to do. The reason that these were selected was because I knew that it would be very divisive, that you would have very competing types of messages or themes that would be drawn out. But I think it would be interesting to see from either Reuters or NPR or something like that that is perceived to be a bit more neutral, to see how different these messages are, or are we seeing correlations between them? I think it would be interesting to do. I also have kind of in my head another plan that I may start to look at, and that's still continuing on with these two sources, but looking post-presidential election to see if a lot of the same type of rhetoric is continued or if it starts to kind of fall short. Because part of it was that, knowing that those were two so politically kind of polarizing, that it's all leading up to the presidential election. And once that dies down, not that to say that politics are no longer important, but are some of these issues really as or put out to the public as something that is imperative that needs to change now. I guess that part doesn't really answer your question, but I think you would get very different results if I did select different sources.
All right, so next question. If individuals who did follow either media source made a conscious effort to read literature from both camps, do you think we would be less divisive in society?
I think so. Unfortunately, I don't know that we would have maybe an audience that really is as interested in maybe finding out the full picture as much as they are to sort of satisfy some of their already pre-existing beliefs, which is very cynical of me to think, but I think that we've seen that sort of with the us versus them type of mentality of being the right side or the person that's being proven right is something that we see not just in this conversation, but I think the way that current politics currently stands. I mean, we see a lot of individuals that are more important or more interested in being perceived as the person that's right rather than being the person that's accurate, because one is more popular than the other, which again is a very cynical comment to make, but I feel like this kind of transcends into really what I saw just with the data that I was able to analyze.
And so they also had a follow-up question. Is there a media source that provides both viewpoints that you know of?
I know that there are certain sites, I can't remember right off the top of my head, someone else may in the comments, that they actually are able to kind of look back at sort of the perceived bias or the way, where they kind of fall, if it's a bit more neutral, or if they fall on one side as opposed to another. I can't remember what the website was. But again, a lot of that is difficult to go and track because, again, you're trying to come up with neutral ways that you can analyze the stories that are coming through. And it's sometimes difficult to do that when you have more than one topic, which most news organizations are not just reporting on police violence, right? They're reporting on so many other things all at the same time. I think it might be a little more difficult to get a more balanced, I guess, perspective.
All right. Next is there any room for validity? I can't speak this afternoon. Is there any room for validity or truthful news from any news provider, considering they're appealing to their audience? Or how do you find reliable news?
And I guess that is sort of the point of this research, that if you silo yourself into just one source as opposed to taking a little bit more of a pluralistic standpoint of maybe looking at other news providers to see how this is coming through, it may be very difficult to detect. And if you have individuals that intentionally select one specific media source, it can be difficult for them to get out of sort of the walls that they built up around themselves. So if that's sort of the message that sources are trying to appeal to their specific audience, that get your news from us because we're the ones that you agree with. I think it's going to be difficult for people to go and say, well, why would I go somewhere else? Because I'm not going to agree with the politics of this other organization, or I'm going to perceive it in such a way that it seems like it's biased to overcompensate for what some of these issues may look like.
Another comment just came through the chat that kind of is related to that. Isn't the AP good? Most sites spin the info they put out.
Yeah, and there's a lot of aggregate sites that will are reporting on AP stories. Like many times that people are getting stuff from like Yahoo News or some of these other aggregates. They're taking stories that the AP has put out there. So it's not like Yahoo News is presenting like they're reporting on these brand new stories. A lot of that is coming from secondary sources that they're then kind of pushing through. So I would say the AP probably is a good source to try to get many of your stories for, that is considered to be probably way more neutral than maybe some of these cable providers.
Cool. All right, next question. Were many or any of the tweets blatantly false? If not, then the two sources can perhaps be seen as complementary rather than merely in opposition, despite the bias.
From what I could tell, I wouldn't say that there are things that were just blatantly, completely false, as much as they were maybe skewed a little bit with perspective. And I saw that a little bit on both sides. That again, even though there was sort of this indication that Fox News, from the tweets that I saw there, was more likely to characterize these protests as riots based on the things that were going on. They were very careful in not actually calling many of these things actual riots, unless it was a quote from an official source, like it was a quote from local law enforcement, or it was a quote from a politician, or it was a quote from someone that was very, I guess, influential with what was going on. It wasn't necessarily that they would go out, either source, and this is not just Fox News, but CNN also wouldn't necessarily go and blatantly lie, as much as they would kind of push the boundary of, without having the full complete picture, how much of the full story were they actually telling?
All right, and the last question I have for now says, do you think you would find similar results with the January 6th failed coup versus a protest?
I think that you would, partially because it's so much of a divisive line, right? That you have people that would say that, well, these people that they were doing their constitutional right of being able to protest what they perceive to be a biased election or a false election, and they were only doing what they were allowed to go and do, right? Whereas you have another side that's saying, well, no, it looks like, no, there's actually inciting of violence that's gone on. But you don't necessarily see, again, this cross-pollination that you would get from both sources. I can't say without actually looking at the data, but I feel like just based on sort of the types of data I got just from my police use of force, that it wouldn't surprise me to see sort of those as the dividing lines between those two perspectives.
Well, Dr. Callahan, thank you for this very interesting presentation. I'd like to thank everyone else for attending this talk. Before we conclude, I'd just like to make a quick announcement about the colloquia for next year. We are working on scheduling the 2022 to 2023 academic year faculty colloquium. At this point, we're looking to do some virtual, some in person. As we schedule that, we will kind of publish details. With that, let me just triple check. I got one question, or someone said great job. Not a question, but great job, Jason, or Dr. Callahan. So with that, we're done with today's session. Thank you all for coming, like Dr. Callahan said, on the last class day of the semester. We look forward to seeing you next year when we do these again. So thank you guys and have a great day.